My introduction to Garth Ennis was through the boys' comics. Needless to say, it became evident that the man hates the idea of metahumans running in to save the world. Curiosity got the better of me and I dug deeper, which led me to his other comics. Then I came across Hitman and its spin-off, All-Star Section 8, which was clearly a satire on superhero culture. But yeah, it was a controlled take. Finally, after reading Ennis's Punisher under Marvel's Max imprint, which had no superheroes or supervillains, it was crystal clear that Garth Ennis has nothing but scorn for superheroes. But why? I mean, he's a superhero comic writer. Then how come he himself hates the idea of superheroes so much? That's my job today. To find out what made Garth Ennis ridicule metahumans so much that he went off the rails during The Boys. Ennis is a Northern Irish comic writer who grew up in a house with no religion whatsoever. In fact, the first time he ever got familiar with the concept of a god being out there, Ennis found the logic that God can see inside everyone's heart and punishes the wrongdoers to be bewildering and kind of terrifying. Now, the thing is, superheroes and gods have kind of always gone hand in hand. Basically, superheroes became synonymous with gods in the contemporary world, carrying myths of immortality and inhuman power. I mean, Marvel gave us Thor and whatnot, and DC created Wonder Woman, characters which are deeply rooted in spiritual beliefs and religious legends. Understandably, Ennis, who couldn't wrap his head around the idea of this unseen power in the first place, could neither convince himself about superheroes. Interestingly, when he wrote the comic book series Preacher, he even used this as a framework where he told the story of a preacher from Texas named Jesse Custer. Jesse gets accidentally possessed by a supernatural being named Genesis, who embodies both good and evil. As a result, Custer became virtually the most powerful being in the world. So, two things are established. One, Garth Ennis has no belief in the world beyond perceivable reality, and two, he is great at taking a dig. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ennis had begun building a reputation in British comics, including work for 2000 AD. Soon, he wrote stories for the character Judge Dredd, who was co-created by John Wagner. Even with Dredd, Ennis penned stories which attacked mainstream pop music. Ennis got his big break with the DC's Vertigo line, known for its mature storytelling, and took over Hellblazer in 1991. The series was important for him, not just because it marked his entry into one of the most prominent comic publishers, but also because it brought him together with artist Steve Dillon, who would later collaborate with him on many of his best works. In 1995, he joined Marvel, but kept on pushing against the stereotypes. In fact, with Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe in 1995, Ennis presented one alternate reality where Frank Castle systematically wipes out the heroes one by one, further emphasizing his disdain for them. Matthew Rosenberg, who wrote Marvel's The Punisher comic in 2018 to 2019, also agreed with Ennis and stated that he was quite a fan of how Garth portrayed Castle. To quote him, "There is no debating whether Frank Castle is a good guy or a hero. He isn't. And Ennis does a great job of making you root for him and then scolding you for doing it." However, when Marvel changed his dialogues without his permission, he quit. They, however, brought him back for Marvel Knight's Punisher after the end of Hitman. But after having had enough and failing to find violence comedic after the September 11th attacks, Ennis shifted his focus for Punisher stories toward a dark one, and relaunched The Punisher under Marvel's Max imprint. If he hated superheroes so much, why did he even take up writing comics as a profession, right? Well, it turns out Frank Miller managed to convince him. So Ennis grew up reading British comics in his formative years, and actually never read a superhero comic until he was in his late teens. He reveals on the podcast Previews World that, well, I've been thinking about this a bit recently myself, just because, I'm about to hit the 30-year mark this year in my career. And I figured out that the reason is when I was a kid where I grew up, a small town outside Belfast, the distribution of comics wasn't really as extensive as it might have been in Belfast itself. I always saw the British newsstand titles. The American comics that I did see were few and far between, and I just didn't see enough of them to develop much of an interest. He further stated, I'd have the same interest in American comics and superhero comics that everyone else does. because it's kind of like religion. If you get it that young, you're never going to get rid of it. Once the hook's in you, you can't really get it out. I would contend that you can't really come to material like that as an adult and develop the same affection for it you do as a kid. And that's why I ended up liking what I liked and writing what I write. Rather, he grew up reading one-shot stories on war found in British libraries. In an interview on Coffee and Heroes, Ennis said,
I don't discover American comics in any real way until I'm in Korean's bookshop, now long gone,
in 1986, and I found a copy of The Dark Knight Returns. That was my first American comic cover to cover. Ennis later realized that the problem was that once he started with Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, everything else felt like a step down. At first, he thought he was wrong about American comics, and that maybe the few issues he'd had seen at the newsstands hadn't done them justice. All excited and hopeful, he went out and bought a bunch of imports, only to find most of them disappointing. What Ennis didn't realize at the time was that The Dark Knight Returns was itself a leap forward to something extremely different in the comic world. He understood that much later as he became more familiar with the American comic culture. By then, even though shops like Dark Horizons and Talisman had made those comics easier to find, his perspective was already set, and Miller had etched his influence in his mind. He was so inspired by the writer that he cited his depiction of Nick Fury in Elektra Assassin as his benchmark for writing the character. He said that he was blown away by how Miller approached his comic writing as a novelist. Ennis was already excited about a creative profession, and Miller's materials, along with some other mid-80s mature comics like Love and Rockets and Swamp Thing, led him to take up comic writing as a career. But when it came to American superhero comics, he found them ridiculous and silly. According to him, when people look at superheroes, that's all they see. But for him, the only thing he can envision while looking at characters like Nick Fury, Punisher, and The Shadow are gunmen like the ones he grew up with. He said in an interview, "Those are quite naturally the characters I gravitate towards, because they feel the closest to my own background in comics, movies, and TV." He continued, "I find most superhero stories completely meaningless. So long as the industry is geared towards fulfilling audience demand, i.e. for the same brightly colored characters doing the same thing forever, you're never going to see any real growth in it. The stories can't end, so they'll never mean anything." If you've been following this far, the point is pretty simple. Garth Ennis has been spewing a hate on Caped Crusaders and the Christian belief ever since he held a pen. But when it came to The Boys, he surpassed all levels. It's like whatever frustration and disgust he had for the genre bled out onto the pages without any restrictions whatsoever. Interestingly, The Boys started out under DC's imprint Wildstorm. But it's DC we're talking about. Of course they weren't comfortable after realizing what Ennis was actually doing here. He was taking superheroes and putting them through a ringer, like they were the most horrible things that had ever been created. It was a potential disrepute for DC to be associated with such anti-superhero publications, given how they've glorified metahumans for decades. Obviously, things reached a tipping point, and after 6 issues, they abruptly canceled the series. When Newsarama asked Ennis for a comment on this, he stated, "It became obvious to all concerned that The Boys should never have been published at DC. And to their credit, they were working hard to release the rights so that Derek and I could find the book a new home. We're already looking at offers from a number of publishers and plan to return with number 7 and the first trade collection in a matter of a few months." Artist Derek Robertson also supported Ennis, and though he was on an exclusive contract to DC, Robertson was given special permission to continue working on The Boys. Finally, in early 2007, Dynamite Entertainment gave a new home to Billy Butcher and his gang, and even published the first 6 issues as a collected edition titled The Name of the Game. 2 years later, Dynamite even announced a spin-off series, Herogasm, and other subsequent issues like Butcher, Baker, Candlestick Maker, and Highland Laddie. But one question still lingers. What motivated Garth Ennis to write The Boys? As it so happens, he wrote it at a grim time when bad men were doing their things. Basically, he was referring to a period when Bush and Cheney had just been reelected, the Iraq War was escalating, and Hurricane Katrina had left New Orleans devastated. He lost his shit, realizing how the entertainment world was trying to divert people's attention using their colorful stories. In Ennis's words, there's apparently no end in sight to the saturation of film and TV by superheroes. They seem to be the perfect fantasy of hope and empowerment for a world that increasingly lacks either. Personally, I have not grown up with superheroes. I find them completely moronic. To change the landscape, he started writing about corporate corruption of government and the abuse and abandonment of common people. He said, in terms of fiction, the kinds of protagonists we had at the time were Tony Soprano and Vic Mackey, bad men guiding us around a bad world. And that's how The Boys was born. And then came the series. Garth Ennis believes that had DC not let them go, they would have died on the vine and there wouldn't have been a television series at all. He continued that even after he got all his success, he's still pretty dismissive of superheroes. Eric Kripke, who is The Boys' showrunner and executive producer, has been working alongside Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg, and James Weaver, who were part of Point Grey Pictures and were known for working on the ultra-violent series Preacher, which was adapted from Ennis's work too. Eric himself had been a fan of Ennis's work. He revealed both the comic and the show are about how completely ridiculous celebrity culture is. It's also about how completely ridiculous and corrupt politics are, and media, and how the worst of it all is when they combine into one thing. And Garth was writing about that in 2006 and 2007. The real world has come to reflect the world of The Boys more than it ever has. So yeah, they know the drill, and that's exactly why Boys worked out so well on screen. Kripke said in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, "I'm just doing my best to reflect the tone that Garth Ennis created. He's a master at mixing hardcore violence with absurd humor with political commentary, and I'm just trying to match that. We're depicting how we feel real humans would behave if they had the power. They would abuse it." Still, Kripke has agreed that there's a line for television broadcasting that they can't cross. What he does is maneuver to put something crazy or visually insane in every episode. There's explosive eviscerations, there's dolphin erotica, there's fatal sex. There's using children as murder weapon. The Boys tells you exactly what it is from the very first scene. A guy runs through a woman at super speed and causes her to explode into a mess of blood and body parts. Just like the comics, the show dives into the toxic cocktail of power and fame in the age of media. The most intriguing part is how it completely flips the idea of heroes. It's like Ennis walked into Marvel and DC and said, "Uno reverse." I mean, that comparison actually works, right? Instead of showing superheroes as saviors, we got a bunch of normal people going after the Seven and the billion-dollar company Vought, which keeps their soups and fuck-ups corruptions buried. Yeah, that's how Vought behaves. However, there seems to be some partialities. Sure, Ennis has taken shots at celebrity culture, but it feels like he's been somewhat apathetic when it comes to Hollywood. And since he leans strongly left, he rarely criticizes the left overall. He's not held back in expressing his views again and again in various interviews, and claimed, "The appeal for me is that I could write about life as I find it, rather than idealized fantasy figures that bear no relation to reality. The notion that the medium I work in is dominated by such a stupid genre is not one that feeds my sense of idealism. They've ruined comics, so there's no reason why they can't ruin film and TV as well. See, I understand that times are such when staying hopeful might come off as naive. Yet, Ennis's take that darkness is all we need and inspiring examples are not acceptable in fiction anymore is a bit too stretched. He's the kind of guy who probably believes that Superman's fall over the years was because people are not ready to buy the idea of a guy living through bright adventures. Yeah, the superhero genre is undergoing some radical changes with shows like Watchmen and films like Brightburn, but Ennis believes that the perception of the audience and readers about superheroes hasn't yet changed that much. I'm going to end this video with a last display of how Garth Ennis leaves no stone unturned to attack Marvel and DC. In a comic book interview, he mentioned, "It'll be interesting to see a mainstream audience's reaction to superhero characters being dragged through the mud, especially now that they've been educated to the notion of shared universes and multiverses by the last 10 years worth of Marvel and DC movies and TV. Ouch. Alright guys, that's all for today. Ennis's resentment for superheroes is so deep that even Scorsese's statement calling the MCU not cinema seems bland in comparison. I acknowledge that his upbringing has played a huge role in shaping his viewpoints, and I absolutely take a bow for how boldly Ennis depicts the truth. But maybe sometimes everyone needs a little escape from reality, my guy. Do let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.